Hey guys, tonight we are going to slow things way down. We're stepping back, way back, thousands of years, to a quiet corner of ancient Egypt. Forget the pharaohs, the pyramids, the bustling markets along the Nile. Tonight, our focus is singular, specific, and perhaps incredibly tedious. We are going to meticulously examine the order in which a humble ancient Egyptian monk ate his vegetarian meal. Picture the scene, the low light of a lamp flickering in a sparse stone room, the only sounds the gentle rustle of simple cloth and the quiet presence of others engaged in the same silent task. You are sitting there, the rough texture of a wooden bowl beneath your fingers, a meteor plate before you, holding the entirety of your evening sustenance. It's not a feast. It's not exciting. It's just food. In a specific order. Honestly, this might be the most boring thing we've ever covered, and you probably won't survive the sheer lack of drama without drifting off. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fun to see who's trying to drift off with me around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you are there. Not visiting, but being one of these monks. You've chosen a life apart, a life of spiritual discipline and detachment from the worldly fuss. Your days are dictated by the rhythm of prayer, contemplation, and manual labor. And central to that daily rhythm are the meals. Simple, infrequent, and taken in silence. You sit on a mat or a low stool in the refectory, the communal dining hall, alongside your brothers. There's no chatter, no clinking of cutlery, because there's hardly any cutlery. Just the quiet presence of others, each focused inward, or perhaps just focused on the plate before them. The room is cool, built of stone or mud brick, providing a welcome respite from the Egyptian sun. The air is dry, carrying faint scents, perhaps old straw mats, the lingering smell of dust, and the very mild aroma of the food laid out. You glance at the plate, likely a simple piece of pottery or wood, and the bowl before you. It's not a lot. It's vegetarian, deliberately so, as part of the ascetic discipline you've embraced. No juicy roasted meats here, no rich stews bubbling with animal fat. Just the quiet, unpretentious fare of plants. The specific arrangement of the food, and the prescribed order in which you are meant to consume it, is part of the structure, part of the control over the physical self that is central to this monastic life. It's not about enjoyment, it's about sustenance, about fueling the body just enough for prayer and work, without indulging the senses. And the order, the order. That's the truly sleep-inducing part. Because it's methodical. Repetitive. Predictable. Like watching paint dry, but for your taste buds. Ancient Egyptian monasticism, particularly in the early Christian period, roughly 3rd century CE onwards, though solitary asceticism existed earlier, was a significant historical movement. These communities, or individuals living as hermits, withdrew from society into the deserts to pursue a life of devotion and austerity. This choice to live apart, often in harsh conditions, became a major force in the development of Christian monasticism, a mainstream historical fact that shaped religious practice for centuries to come. It wasn't just a few scattered hermits, entire communities formed, developing rules and structures for their lives, including how they ate. Within these communities, the rules could be quite strict, especially regarding diet. The emphasis was on simplicity and avoidance of luxury. Meat was generally forbidden, not necessarily because it was seen as inherently evil, but because it was associated with indulgence, with feasts, with the worldly life they had renounced. A vegetarian diet was simpler, cheaper, and considered more conducive to spiritual focus. Fasting was also a regular practice, making the infrequent meals even more significant as moments of controlled sustenance. A quirky tidbit about their diet is that despite being vegetarian, they were apparently big fans of onions and garlic. These pungent bulbs, while perhaps not what you'd expect in an ascetic diet, were staple foods for many Egyptians, providing flavor and believed to have medicinal properties. So, while you're foregoing roast duck, you might be tucking into a meal that leaves you with distinctly garlicky breath. Not exactly ideal for silent, close-quarters contemplation, but practical. It's like saying no to cake but yes to a whole raw onion. Priorities, right? The specific details of monastic life, including the exact order of meals and the rules surrounding consumption, were often laid out in texts written by monastic leaders, sometimes called rules or institutes. However, historians still argue whether these written rules were always strictly followed in practice by all monasteries and all monks, or if there was variation in interpretation depending on the community, the abbot, or even individual inclination. Were these detailed instructions the rigid reality for every monk, every day, or more of an aspirational guideline? We're leaning into the idea of a specific order tonight, because boring historical variations in monastic dietary practice is a bit less catchy. So, you sit there, the food before you. It's plain. Likely consists of bread, maybe some cooked legumes, like lentils or fava beans, perhaps some dried figs or dates, and yes, possibly those ubiquitous onions or garlic. Water or diluted wine would be your drink. No elaborate sauces, no fancy presentations. The appearance of the food itself is designed not to excite, but merely to inform. This is fuel. The silence in the refectory is profound. The scraping of a bowl, the sound of chewing, kept to a minimum, one assumes, your own quiet breathing. Your mind is meant to be on prayer or scripture, not on the flavors or textures. But the physical reality is there. The plate. The bowl. The simple fare. And the order. The prescribed sequence in which you must approach this humble array of nourishment. It's a slow, deliberate process, designed to strip away even the simple pleasure of choosing what to eat next. Every bite, every sip, is governed by routine. And that routine, that predictable sequence, is our guide into the depths of historical tranquility tonight. Get ready for methodical chewing. You're sitting there, feeling the rough texture of that simple plate, the stillness settling over you. To understand the order of the meal, we first need to understand who is sitting there, and why they chose this life that involves contemplating a plate of lentils with such intensity. These weren't just random folks, they were part of a specific, growing movement in ancient Egypt, early monasticism. Think about the world outside the monastery walls. It was chaotic, tempting, full of obligations and distractions. Society had its rules, its hierarchies, its endless pursuit of material things. These people chose a different path. They felt a deep pull towards a life focused solely on the divine, on purifying themselves, on disconnecting from the noise of the world to listen to something deeper. It's like the ancient equivalent of deciding to sell all your possessions, move to a remote cabin, and definitely not check social media ever again. Except they did it for God, in the desert, and without artisanal coffee. So, who are they? They came from various backgrounds. Some might have been farmers, others scribes, merchants, even former soldiers. They weren't exclusively from the lowest classes. The call to asceticism could affect anyone seeking a radical form of piety. They were men, and in separate communities, women, who made a conscious, deliberate decision to renounce their former lives, their families, their possessions, and retreat. This choice to live a life of renunciation and spiritual discipline in community or alone was a defining feature of early Christian monasticism in Egypt. And it's a mainstream historical fact that their practices significantly influenced the development of monasticism across the Mediterranean world. They were the pioneers of organized spiritual dropoutism. There were generally two main flavors of this early monasticism: the anchoritic life, where monks lived as solitary hermits in caves or simple cells, often far from others, wrestling with their own thoughts and the desert demons, literally, in their beliefs. And the cenobitic life, where monks lived together in communities under a common rule, sharing resources, labor, prayer, and yes, meals. Our scene tonight, in the refectory with others, places you firmly in a cenobitic community. These communities provided structure, support, and accountability, which for many was more sustainable than radical solitude. Imagine trying to stick to a strict diet when there's literally no one around to see if you sneak an extra figure. Community makes discipline easier, sometimes. Their motivation was profound. They were often driven by a fervent desire for salvation, a belief that through rigorous self-denial and constant prayer, they could draw closer to God and perhaps even attain a form of spiritual perfection. They saw the physical world, and especially the desires of the body, as obstacles to spiritual growth. The harshness of the desert environment wasn't a bug, it was a feature. It provided a ready-made challenge, a constant test of their commitment and reliance on the divine. It was like signing up for a spiritual extreme fitness boot camp that lasted your entire life. Life in these communities was anything but idle. Days were filled with a demanding schedule. Hours were spent in communal prayer, chanting psalms, and listening to scripture. A significant portion of the day was dedicated to manual labor, essential for self-sufficiency. They cultivated small gardens where possible. Those onions and lentils had to come from somewhere, wove baskets from palm fronds, made ropes, or copied manuscripts. The products of their labor were used within the community or traded for necessities they couldn't produce themselves. This wasn't just busy work, it was seen as a way to combat idleness, which they believed led to temptation, and as a form of physical prayer. Plus, you needed a hobby that didn't involve, worldly pleasures. Basket weaving fits the bill perfectly. Poverty was embraced. Possessions were minimal, a simple tunic, a cloak, a mat for sleeping, perhaps a few tools or books. Food was deliberately plain and sufficient only to sustain life, not to provide pleasure. Sleep was limited. Silence was often observed for long periods. It was a life of intentional hardship, undertaken voluntarily. You definitely wouldn't find them complaining about lukewarm food on Yelp. For one thing, no Yelp. For another, complaining was probably frowned upon. Massively. A quirky tidbit about their communal living was the strict discipline around interaction. While they lived together, conversation was often limited to necessary exchanges or spiritual discussion. Silence was valued, not just during meals. This meant your social life was probably quieter than a library after closing time. Imagine living with dozens or hundreds of people and barely speaking. It adds another layer to the quiet atmosphere of that refectory we're picturing. Pass the lentils. Silent nod. Thank you. Silent nod. Exciting stuff. Historians still argue whether the development of cenobitic monasticism in Egypt was a direct evolution from the solitary hermit tradition, with people seeking more structure, or if it was influenced by earlier, non-Christian communal ascetic groups or even Egyptian temple communities. Did the hermits inspire the communities, or were there other, older models for this kind of shared, disciplined life? It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation for ancient religious movements. Regardless of the precise origins, these communities provided a framework for hundreds, sometimes thousands, of individuals seeking this intense spiritual path. They were centers of prayer, labor, and austere living, scattered across the Egyptian landscape, particularly in the desert regions like Sais, Nitria, and the area around Thebes. So, when you sit there, contemplating your simple vegetarian meal, remember that you are part of this larger movement. You are one person among many who have chosen this life of quiet devotion and rigorous self-discipline. Every aspect of your day, including the composition and consumption of your food, is structured to support this spiritual goal. The plainness of the meal, the silence, the very order in which you eat it, it's all part of the practice. It's not just dinner, it's a spiritual exercise. And that quiet, methodical approach to something as basic as eating is exactly what makes this history so wonderfully, incredibly, sleep-inducing. Get ready to explore the edible consequences of this ascetic choice. You are one of them, one of the quiet individuals who chose this path. And where did they choose to walk it? In the desert. Not the bustling, fertile banks of the Nile, but the arid, seemingly empty stretches of sand and rock that lay beyond the reach of the annual flood. This wasn't a punishment, it was a deliberate choice of environment, a physical space designed to mirror and support the internal landscape they sought to cultivate. Imagine the desert landscape surrounding the monastery. Endless, undulating dunes stretching to the horizon, or stark, rocky hills rising abruptly from the plain. The colors are muted, ochre, sand-colored beige, dusty gray, the pale blue of a relentless sky. The air is incredibly dry, often hot during the day, but it can become surprisingly cool at night. The sun beats down with fierce intensity, bleaching the landscape and highlighting every ripple in the sand, every crack in the rock. This choice of the desert as the prime location for monastic settlement is a mainstream historical fact. It provided the isolation and harsh conditions that early ascetics sought for spiritual discipline. It was nature's own strict abbot. Why the desert? It was seen as a place devoid of worldly temptations. No bustling markets, no theaters, no taverns, no opportunities for idle gossip or inappropriate encounters. It was empty, forcing the monk inward. It was also seen as a battleground, a place where the demons, the personifications of temptations, doubts, and worldly desires, were believed to roam freely, making it the ideal arena for spiritual combat. Living there was a constant confrontation with the self and with unseen forces. Plus, rent was cheap. Very, very cheap. The monastery itself would be a haven within this harshness, but still reflecting the ascetic ideal. Picture the walls, often made of mud brick, thick and sturdy, designed to keep out not just the elements and potential raiders, but also the world. Inside, it wouldn't be luxurious. There would be a collection of simple cells, small rooms for individual monks, perhaps just large enough for a sleeping mat and a few possessions. These cells offered solitude for prayer and contemplation when not engaged in communal activities. There would be communal spaces, a church or chapel for shared worship, workshops for their manual labor. The rhythmic sound of weaving or hammering might be one of the few recurring noises, storerooms for food and supplies, and crucially, the refectory, the dining hall where you are now sitting. These buildings would be functional, built for necessity rather than beauty, using local materials. Stone were available, but mostly mud brick, plastered and perhaps whitewashed to reflect the harsh sun. The atmosphere within the monastery walls was one of profound quiet. The vastness of the surrounding desert seemed to press in, muffling sound. Within the community, intentional silence was often practiced for large parts of the day. The only sounds might be the wind whistling around the buildings, the distant braying of a donkey used for transport, the rhythmic work in the workshops, the chanting during communal prayer, and the quiet sounds of daily life, like fetching water or sweeping dust. It was a soundscape of simplicity and restraint. Feel the air on your skin. Dry, perhaps carrying the fine grit of sand. Smell the faint earthiness of the mud brick walls, maybe the sharper scent of drying palm leaves if you were near a workshop. See the quality of the light, sharp and bright during the day, turning golden and soft in the late afternoon, and then the deep, inky blackness of the desert night, often filled with an astonishing number of stars, visible without any light pollution. That vast, star-filled sky would have been a constant reminder of the cosmic scale and the divine. A quirky tidbit about living in these desert monasteries is how resourceful they became. They learned to conserve every drop of precious water, developing ingenious systems for collecting and storing it. They adapted their building techniques to the extreme climate, creating structures that remained relatively cool inside. They even learned to cultivate small patches of land in the desert, channeling scarce water to grow the very vegetables and legumes that formed the basis of their diet. Their survival was a testament to human adaptability and determination, coupled with deep faith. It wasn't just sitting and praying, it was practical, gritty survival against the odds. They were like ancient, spiritual preppers. Historians still argue whether the primary draw of the desert for these monks was purely theological and ascetic, seeking isolation and spiritual battle, or if there were also socio-economic factors at play, such as escaping the burdens of taxation, social unrest, or the complexities of life in the populated Nile Valley. Was it solely about finding God, or also about finding a simpler, more controllable life away from societal pressures? The motivations were likely complex and varied from individual to individual. The isolation of the desert environment reinforced the detachment from the world that the monks sought. Visitors were rare, and interactions with outsiders were limited. This created a closed, self-contained world focused inward on the spiritual lives of its inhabitants. The rhythm of life was dictated not by external events, but by the internal clock of prayer and the simple demands of survival and labor. And this environment, this quiet, isolated, disciplined world, is the setting for your simple meal. The refectory, though communal, carries the same quietude as the individual cells. The food reflects the austerity of the surroundings and the discipline of the life. There are no distractions from the outside world to interrupt your focus. Just the simple plate, the simple food, and the quiet presence of your brethren. The desert shapes not just the physical monastery, but the very experience of being within it, including the quiet, methodical process of eating. It grounds the abstract spiritual goals in a very real, very dry, very quiet physical space. And the silence of that space is the perfect backdrop for contemplating the order of your meal. You're settled in that quiet refectory, the desert stillness pressing and even here within the monastery walls. The air is dry, the light low. You're ready to contemplate the meal before you, but first, let's place this moment within the larger rhythm of your day. Because a monk's life wasn't just random acts of piety interspersed with snacks. Oh no! It was structured, rigid, dictated by the needs of prayer and labor, and the meals were just one small, functional component of that tightly controlled schedule. Imagine the day beginning long before dawn. The sounds that break the desert silence are likely not roosters, but the call to prayer, perhaps a simple bell or a horn. You rise from your mat in your small cell, the stone floor cool beneath your bare feet. The first hours of the day are dedicated to communal prayer, chanting psalms together in the dim light of the chapel. Your voice, perhaps rough from the dry air, blends with the others, a low, rhythmic sound filling the sacred space. After prayer comes the first block of manual labor. You might head to the workshops, the rhythmic thud of reeds being woven into baskets, or the scraping of tools on wood filling the air. Or perhaps you go to the monastery garden, if there is one, working the dry soil, tending to the resilient plants that provide your sustenance. The sun rises, and the work continues, steady, repetitive, demanding physical effort. It's designed to keep the body busy and the mind focused, preventing idle hands and idle thoughts. Then might come periods of solitary prayer or contemplation in your cell, or perhaps study if you are literate and the monastery has manuscripts. The hours pass, marked by the sun's movement across the sky and further calls to prayer at set intervals throughout the day. It's a life of routine, of repetition, of finding spiritual depth in the mundane tasks and the constant turning of the mind towards the divine. This strict division of the day into periods of prayer, labor, and rest, often following a set timetable, a horarium, is a mainstream historical fact of organized monasticism, designed to create a disciplined and focused life. It was like a spiritual factory assembly line, but with fewer robots and more chanting. And the meals? They fit into this rigid structure not as breaks for leisure or social interaction, but as necessary pauses for refueling the body. Monks typically ate infrequently, often only once a day, usually in the late afternoon or evening, after the main work of the day was done. Some stricter monasteries might have had 2 meals, but never more, and fasting days, which were common, would involve even less food or none at all. So, the meal you are contemplating isn't a light lunch followed by dinner. It might be the only solid food you consume all day. This infrequency added to its significance as a moment of necessary, controlled sustenance, not enjoyment. Imagine waiting all day for your one plate of, well, we'll get to that. When the time for the meal arrived, there would be another signal, perhaps a bell or a call. Monks would gather from their various tasks, purify their hands, and proceed in an orderly fashion to the refectory. Silence was usually observed during the meal, sometimes complete silence, sometimes allowing for scripture readings by one monk while the others ate. This wasn't a time for chatting about your basket weaving progress or complaining about the dryness of the bread. It was a continuation of the contemplative discipline, a practice of mindful eating, focusing inward even while performing the physical act of consuming food. This silence was a deliberate rule in many monastic communities, a quirky tidbit that sets monastic meals apart from typical communal dining. It really cuts down on dinner party awkwardness, I guess. The whole process of the meal, from gathering to eating to dispersing, was likely conducted with minimal fuss and maximum order. You wouldn't rush, but you wouldn't linger either. The food was served simply, perhaps already portioned onto plates or distributed from common bowls. You ate what you were given, without complaint or comment. It was fuel for the machine of prayer and labor, nothing more. Historians still argue whether the strictness of the horarium and the rules surrounding meals, like complete silence, were uniformly enforced across all early Egyptian monasteries, or if there was variation based on the size, location, or the specific traditions established by the founding abbot. Did every monk eat at precisely the same time every day? Was the silence absolute everywhere? Or did human nature and regional differences lead to some flexibility or even bending of the rules? It's hard to know the exact lived reality for every single monk in every single community. But the ideal was clear, a life structured around spiritual pursuits, with physical needs like eating reduced to their simplest, most controlled form. The meal wasn't a reward, it was a necessity, integrated into the relentless cycle of prayer, work, and silence. It was a task to be performed mindfully, perhaps even grudgingly, certainly not with eager anticipation. So, as you sit there, plate before you, remember the long hours that led to this moment. The early morning chill, the hours of chanting, the physical labor under the sun, the periods of quiet contemplation. This meal is the physical anchor in that demanding spiritual journey. It's not a break from the discipline, it's discipline applied to eating. Every bite, every gesture, is part of the larger commitment. And understanding that context makes the meticulous focus on the order of consumption less about bizarre historical etiquette and more about a profound system of self-control. It's like the ultimate mindful eating practice, except the goal isn't digestive health, it's spiritual enlightenment. And possibly avoiding eternal damnation. Small differences. The food sits there, simple, unadorned. It represents the bounty that can be coaxed even from the edge of the desert through hard work, but presented in a way that discourages any sensual delight. Your task now is to consume it, not just mindlessly, but according to a quiet, perhaps unspoken, order. The daily structure has led you to this moment of stillness and sustenance. Now, the specific protocol for consuming that sustenance awaits our sleepy examination. You're sitting there, plate before you, the scent of simple cooked food just hinting in the dry air. We know this meal is part of the monastery's rigid daily structure, a moment of disciplined refueling rather than indulgence. And a key aspect of that discipline, evident on your plate, is its vegetarian nature. No meat. No poultry. No fish, usually. This wasn't accidental, it was a deliberate choice, deeply rooted in both their spiritual beliefs and the practical realities of their life. Think about meat in the ancient world. It wasn't typically an everyday staple for the poor or even middle classes, especially in Egypt, where agriculture along the Nile focused heavily on grains. Meat, particularly from larger animals, was often associated with feasts, sacrifices, wealth, and indulgence. It was a treat, a sign of prosperity, something enjoyed at special occasions or by the elite. To these monks, who had renounced worldly wealth and pleasure, eating meat would have felt like a direct contradiction of their vows. Abstaining from meat was a clear, tangible way to practice self-denial and distance themselves from the perceived excesses of the secular world. It was like saying, "Nope, not interested in your fancy steak dinner, I'm on a spiritual cleanse." This deliberate renunciation of meat as part of an ascetic lifestyle is a mainstream historical fact practiced in various forms across many ancient religious traditions, including early Christian monasticism. Beyond just avoiding luxury, there were spiritual ideas linking diet to purity. While the explicit Jewish dietary laws weren't directly followed, there was a general ascetic concept that heavier, richer foods, particularly meat, somehow weighed down the spirit or stimulated bodily passions that were seen as obstacles to spiritual progress. A lighter, simpler diet was believed to make the body more subservient to the will and the spirit, freeing the mind for prayer and contemplation. It was a kind of internal housekeeping, clearing out the clutter of physical cravings to make space for the divine. Plus, avoiding rich food probably saved them from a lot of ancient indigestion, which must have been a blessing for silent prayer. Gluttony, the sin of overeating or excessive focus on food, was considered one of the principal evil thoughts or vices that monks had to constantly combat. Meat, being calorie-dense and often prepared in richer ways, was seen as more likely to lead to gluttony than a simple meal of bread and vegetables. By sticking to vegetarian fare, they were removing a major temptation to overindulge. It's much harder to accidentally eat 3 plates of plain lentils than it is to polish off a whole roasted chicken, even for a hungry monk. But it wasn't just about high-minded spiritual ideals. Practicality played a huge role. Remember where these monasteries were located? The desert. Raising large numbers of livestock for meat in an arid environment is incredibly difficult. Animals need water, and water was the most precious resource. Growing fields of grain, legumes, and certain hardy vegetables was far more feasible with limited water resources and cultivable land, often near wells or painstakingly irrigated patches. So, their vegetarian diet was also a reflection of what was sustainable in their chosen environment. It's hard to be ascetic if you starve to death because you insisted on keeping a herd of cattle in the Sahara. Furthermore, preserving meat in a hot climate without refrigeration was a challenge. While methods like salting and drying existed, they required salt, which might need to be acquired, and added to the labor involved. Grains, dried legumes, and dried fruits like figs and dates, which formed the bulk of their diet, could be stored for long periods in their dry state, making logistics much simpler. Imagine trying to keep meat fresh for a community of hundreds of monks in the Egyptian desert heat. You'd need a truly miraculous walk-in cooler. Or just eat beans. Beans were the practical choice. A quirky tidbit is that while meat was generally forbidden, there were debates and variations regarding fish. Some monastic rules permitted fish on certain occasions, particularly for monks who were ill or elderly, as it was sometimes seen as less meaty than land animals, or perhaps because fish were associated with biblical meals. However, many stricter communities forbade fish entirely, classifying it simply as another animal product. So, your plate is definitely not fishy tonight. Probably. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for the vegetarian diet in early Egyptian monasticism was the theological commitment to asceticism and purity, or the practical considerations of survival and resource management in the desert environment. Did they choose the desert because it facilitated a vegetarian diet, or did they adopt a vegetarian diet because it was the most practical way to survive in the desert they chose for spiritual reasons? It's a complex interplay of factors, and the emphasis likely varied between different communities and individuals. So, the simple, meatless meal before you isn't a sign of deprivation for its own sake, but a multifaceted expression of the monastic life. It's a spiritual discipline, a practical necessity, and a symbol of their separation from the worldly life they left behind. Every bite, even of plain cooked lentils, is a reminder of the vows you've taken and the path you are walking. You sit there, contemplating the food. Its simplicity is intentional. Its lack of meat is intentional. It's fuel for prayer, for work, for the long, quiet journey towards spiritual goals. There's no anticipation of rich flavors, no excitement about a main course involving animal protein. Just the quiet acceptance of what is necessary, what is disciplined, what is available. And understanding why the meal is vegetarian makes the methodical process of eating it feel even more deliberate. It's not just food, it's a physical manifestation of a philosophy. And now, with the why in mind, we can turn our attention to the what, the specific ingredients that make up this humble, sleep-inducing fare. You're sitting there, focusing on that simple plate of food, understanding why it's vegetarian, a deliberate choice for spiritual discipline and practical survival in the desert. Now, let's actually look at what is on that plate. What were the staple ingredients that made up the daily diet of these ancient Egyptian monks? It wasn't a huge variety, but it was sustenance, drawn from what they could cultivate or, occasionally, find growing wild at the edge of their arid world. The absolute foundation of almost every meal, for almost every Egyptian across society, was bread. And it was no different for the monks. Grain, primarily wheat and barley, was the cornerstone of their diet. They would cultivate fields where possible, often near the Nile or at wells, or trade the products of their labor, like baskets, for grain grown in the fertile valley. This grain was then ground into flour and baked into simple loaves. Bread wasn't just a side dish, it was often the main source of calories and bulk. It's a mainstream historical fact that bread made from emmer wheat or barley was the most important dietary staple in ancient Egypt for millennia, sustaining everyone from pharaohs to peasants, and yes, to monks. It was the original comfort food, though probably not very fluffy. The bread would be simple, unleavened or only slightly leavened, baked in communal ovens within the monastery walls. It was likely dense, chewy, and probably a bit gritty from the stone grinding process. Ancient flour wasn't exactly finely sifted. But it was filling. It provided the necessary energy for hours of prayer and manual labor. You might have a small, round loaf, or perhaps a portion broken off a larger flatbread, sitting on your plate. It would be the anchor of your meal, the reliable constant in a life of few certainties. Next to the bread, you would find the other crucial component of their vegetarian diet, legumes. Lentils, fava beans, broad beans, chickpeas, these were vital sources of protein and fiber. They would be cooked into simple stews or porridges. Imagine a bowl of cooked lentils, perhaps seasoned only with a little salt or those beloved onions and garlic. Not exactly gourmet, but packed with nutrients. These humble beans were the muscle-building blocks of the monastic life, providing the energy needed to weave baskets and chant psalms for hours on end. They were the ancient equivalent of a protein shake, but slightly more earthy. Vegetables added variety and important vitamins, though the range might be limited depending on what could be grown in their specific location or acquired through trade. Onions and garlic, as mentioned, were popular for flavor and health. You might also see cucumbers, lettuce, or mallow, a leafy green vegetable. These could be eaten raw, stewed, or added to the legume dishes. They weren't necessarily served as crisp, colorful salads. They might be soft, cooked down greens or bulbs. Fruits were also part of the diet, particularly dried fruits which could be stored for long periods. Dates and figs were common and provided much-needed sweetness and energy. A few dried figs or dates on your plate would be a small luxury, a concentrated burst of sugar to fuel your contemplation. These weren't eaten by the handful like modern candy. They were likely rationed, a precious source of natural sugar. Beyond cultivation, monks might also supplement their diet through foraging. The desert isn't entirely barren. Certain hardy plants grow, especially near oases or wadis, dry riverbeds that might occasionally flow. This could include wild greens, roots, or desert fruits. A quirky tidbit is that some accounts mention monks eating wild herbs or plants found in the desert, sometimes foraged during their solitary wanderings or labor. This foraging wasn't just for food. Some plants were sought for medicinal properties, while others might have been consumed as an act of humility or extreme asceticism, eating whatever meager sustenance the desert grudgingly offered. It was like a reality show survivor challenge, but the immunity idol was spiritual purity. Historians still argue whether the proportion of cultivated food versus foraged or traded food varied significantly between different monastic communities, depending on their access to water, land, and trade routes. Were some monasteries almost entirely self-sufficient through intense cultivation, while others relied more heavily on trading for grain and supplementing with whatever they could forage? The balance between these sources likely impacted the specific composition of the monks' meals. So, your plate likely contains a piece of dense bread, a portion of cooked lentils or fava beans, perhaps in a slightly watery stew, and maybe a few dried dates or figs, or a bit of cooked onion. That's pretty much it. It's a diet designed for function, not pleasure. Every ingredient is there because it provides necessary nutrients and aligns with the principles of austerity and practicality. There are no hidden delights, no secret stash of ancient Egyptian chocolate. Just the quiet, repetitive reality of bread and beans. Contemplating these simple ingredients, you can almost taste the dry bread, the earthy flavor of the lentils, the sweetness of a date. It's not a symphony of flavors, it's a monotone. But in its simplicity, it reflects the core values of the life you've chosen. It is enough to sustain you. It is plain enough not to tempt you into gluttony. It is readily available through your own labor or simple trade. The food sits there, a visual representation of your commitment. The bread, the staff of life. The lentils, providing strength. The dates, a touch of natural energy. All laid out in a specific way, waiting for the moment you begin to consume them, not in any random order, but following a discipline that extends even to the sequence of chewing and swallowing. It's incredibly specific, incredibly mundane, and perfectly designed to lull you into a state of serene, sleepy calm. The ingredients are known, now, the method awaits. So, you have the ingredients laid out on your plate, the dense bread, the portion of cooked legumes, maybe a few dates or onions. We've traced their journey from the earth, or the market, to your plate. But how did they get from raw ingredients to this state? The food preparation in these ancient monasteries was, predictably, as simple and unadorned as the ingredients themselves. No complex recipes, no elaborate culinary techniques. The goal was functional sustenance, cooked efficiently with minimal resources. Imagine the monastery kitchen, or perhaps just a designated cooking area. It wouldn't be filled with gleaming copper pots or rows of exotic spices. The tools would be basic, fire, pottery, or perhaps some simple metal pots, likely bronze or iron, grinding stones for flour, and perhaps some basic cutting tools. This reliance on fire, pottery, and simple grinding methods for cooking is a mainstream historical fact that held true for most people in ancient Egypt, not just monks. They were cooking pretty much the same way their ancestors had for centuries, adapting timeless techniques to their specific needs. It wasn't exactly the setting for a competitive cooking show. Tonight on Ancient Ascetic Chef, make a delicious lentil stew using only sand, sunshine, and intense spiritual focus. The main cooking methods would involve boiling and baking. Grains were baked into bread, as we've discussed, usually in communal ovens. Legumes like lentils and fava beans, which needed to be softened and made digestible, would be boiled, often for long periods, in pots over an open fire or a simple brazier. Imagine the quiet bubbling of the stew pot, one of the few recurring sounds from the kitchen area. The steam rising, carrying the faint, humble scent of cooked beans and perhaps onion. Vegetables, like onions or mallow leaves, might be added to the boiling legumes to cook down into a kind of stew or thick soup. They weren't generally roasted or fried, as that would require more fuel, oil or fat, which might be scarce or avoided, and could make the food richer, potentially triggering those troublesome thoughts about gluttony. Boiling was simple, efficient, and resulted in food that was easy to digest and unlikely to excite the palate unduly. It's the culinary equivalent of elevator music, functional, unobtrusive, and unlikely to inspire any passionate reactions. The preparation wasn't just about cooking, it also involved tasks like sorting and cleaning the grains and legumes, grinding the flour, and fetching water, often a significant labor, given their desert location. These were manual tasks, often performed communally, contributing to the shared work of the monastery. Imagine sitting with other monks, quietly picking through dried lentils to remove small stones or debris, the only sound the gentle rustle of the beans and the occasional sigh. It's slow, meticulous work, perfectly aligned with the sleep-inducing theme. Seasoning would be minimal. Salt was likely used, being a basic necessity and preservative. Onions and garlic provided the main flavorings. Other spices, if available at all, would have been used very sparingly, if only because they were expensive and might be seen as an unnecessary indulgence. Their food was meant to taste, of itself. The natural flavors of the ingredients, perhaps slightly enhanced by salt and onion, were deemed sufficient. No complex spice blends, no secret family recipes passed down through generations. Just honest, plain food. A quirky tidbit about their food preparation might relate to communal labor. While much of the labor was divided, some focused on weaving, others on cultivation, food preparation was often a shared responsibility, with monks taking turns working in the kitchen or bakery. Even those from more privileged backgrounds would participate in these humble tasks, reinforcing the monastic ideal of equality and service. Imagine a former scribe who used to copy ancient texts now elbow-deep in dough, kneading bread alongside a former farmer. It was a leveling experience, ensuring no one was above the most basic, fundamental work of preparing sustenance for the community. It's like your company CEO having to help out in the office kitchen. Unlikely, but spiritually commendable. Historians still argue whether the specific methods of cooking and food preparation varied significantly between different Cenobitic communities, or if there was a generally shared set of practices based on tradition and practicality. Did some monasteries have slightly more refined cooking techniques? Were seasonings used differently in various regions? Or was the emphasis on absolute simplicity and uniformity such that cooking methods were remarkably similar everywhere? Details are sparse, leaving room for scholarly debate on the nuances of ancient monastic cuisine. The serving of the meal itself was also simple. Food was portioned out onto individual plates or into bowls before the monks entered the refectory, or perhaps distributed quickly by monks assigned to kitchen duties. There was no serving yourself, no choosing how much you took. You received your allotted portion, sufficient for sustenance, but not for excess. This control over portion size was another layer of the discipline, preventing gluttony and ensuring equal shares for everyone. So, the plate before you holds food that has been carefully cultivated, or acquired, painstakingly prepared using basic methods, boiling, baking, and portioned out according to the monastery's rules. It represents not just a meal, but a process, a cycle of labor, preparation, and disciplined consumption, all integrated into the spiritual life. The texture of the dry bread, the softness of the cooked lentils, the faint scent of onion, They are the result of simple, ancient techniques performed quietly within the monastery walls. As you look at the food, think about the hands that prepared it. The repetitive motion of grinding grain, the warmth of the oven, the quiet bubbling of the pot over the fire. These are the mundane, physical actions that underpin the entire spiritual enterprise. The food is humble, the preparation simpler still. It's a deliberate reduction of complexity, mirroring the stripping away of worldly attachments that the monks sought. And this sheer, unadorned simplicity makes the process of consuming it all the more about method and order, less about flavor or excitement. It's perfectly plain. Perfectly boring. Perfectly conducive to sleep. The preparation is complete, the serving has happened. Now, the quiet ritual of eating, in a specific sequence, awaits. The simple food sits there, ready. The preparation is complete, the portions laid out. And now, the signal comes. Perhaps it's the quiet ringing of a small bell within the monastery walls, or a soft call from an elder, or simply the recognized time of day marked by the sun's position. Whatever the signal, it's time to cease your labor, your prayer, your contemplation, and make your way to the refectory for the communal meal. Imagine where you were. Perhaps you were hunched over in your cell, deep in prayer or quiet thought, the dryness of the air a constant companion. Or maybe you were in the workshop, the rhythmic sounds of weaving or carpentry filling the space, your hands busy with repetitive, calming tasks. Or perhaps you were copying scripture, the scratching of your reed pen on papyrus the only sound. The signal arrives, a gentle interruption in the flow of your discipline. You stop what you are doing. There is no sudden rush, no exclamation of finally, food. This is a transition to another form of discipline. You might tidy your small space, put away your tools or writing materials. Then, you prepare yourself for the move. This involves a simple act of purification, often just washing your hands. Remember that basic ritual from earlier? It's repeated now, rinsing away the dust of labor or the symbolic dirt of the world before engaging in the shared, sacred act of eating. Feel the cool water over your hands, the quick shake to dry them in the air. Now, you leave your individual space and join the quiet stream of your brothers. Monks would typically gather and move towards the refectory in an orderly fashion. There's no pushing or shoving, no competitive jostling for the best seat or the biggest portion. The movement is likely silent or conducted with minimal, necessary communication. Imagine the quiet sound of sandaled feet shuffling on stone or packed earth paths. The rustle of simple linen or wool robes. The collective presence of many individuals, moving as one body towards a common purpose, yet each remaining inwardly focused. This orderly gathering for communal activities, including meals, was a defining feature of Cenobitic monasticism, a mainstream historical fact that distinguished it from the more individualistic hermit life. It was less of a free-for-all buffet line and more of a slow, meditative procession. You might walk with your head slightly bowed, eyes downcast, avoiding unnecessary visual distractions or direct eye contact that could lead to conversation or break your contemplative state. The path might take you across an open courtyard, where the bright sun is beginning its descent, casting long shadows. Or perhaps through cool, stone corridors, the air still holding the coolness of the earlier hours. The scents might change subtly as you approach the refectory, perhaps the faint smell of old cooking fires, or the yeasty scent of fresh bread if the baking happened recently. As you approach the refectory entrance, you might pause briefly. Perhaps there was a simple blessing offered before entering, a moment of gratitude for the food about to be received. Then, you step across the threshold. The air inside is likely cooler than outside, sheltered by thick walls. The space is simple, long, low tables, perhaps just boards on supports, and seating, maybe simple stools or mats on the floor. The light is likely low, perhaps only natural light from high windows or the soft glow of oil lamps already lit for the evening meal. You find your place. In some monasteries, seating might have been assigned, perhaps based on seniority or the order in which you entered the community. In others, you might sit wherever there is a free spot. Imagine the quiet settling of bodies onto mats or stools, the slight rustle of robes as everyone finds their position. The silence deepens as the last monk enters and settles. This moment of communal stillness before the meal is a powerful one, a collective centering before the physical act of eating begins. It's like everyone hitting the mute button simultaneously. It's so quiet, you could probably hear a date drop. Though dropping food might also be frowned upon. On the tables or low platforms before the seating, you see the plates and bowls that were prepared earlier. Your plate, with its portion of bread, lentils, and perhaps dates. The simple drink vessel beside it. Seeing the food laid out confirms the purpose of this gathering. It's not a meeting or another prayer service, it is time to eat. A quirky tidbit about their seating arrangements is that in some communities, the abbot or community leader would sit at the head of the table, often facing the door, symbolizing his role as the shepherd and protector of the flock. His presence would reinforce the discipline and order of the meal. He might be the one who gave the initial blessing or signal to begin eating. Historians still argue whether the degree of formality and ritual surrounding the entrance into the refectory and the seating arrangements was uniformly strict across all early Egyptian monasteries, or if practices varied significantly, ranging from highly ritualized processions to more informal, though still orderly, gatherings. Was finding your assigned spot a complex piece of choreography, or just a practical way to fill the room? The atmosphere is one of anticipation, not of culinary delight, but of quiet necessity. Your stomach may be empty after a long day of labor and infrequent meals. The simple food on the plate represents the necessary energy you need to continue your spiritual journey. You are aware of the presence of your brothers around you, a silent community sharing this moment of sustenance. Yet, your focus remains inward, or on the simple act about to commence. You are seated now, hands perhaps resting quietly in your lap or on the edge of the table. The prepared food is directly before you. The journey from your cell or workshop to this seat in the refectory has been a short one in distance, but marked by ritual and intentional quietude. The physical act of moving, the washing of hands, the silent progression, the settling into your place, it all serves to prepare you for the next stage, the consumption of the meal itself. The quiet is profound. You are aware of your own breathing, the subtle sounds of others adjusting themselves. The simple dishes sit waiting. The moment of receiving the food is past, it was placed before you. The moment of eating is about to begin. It will be a deliberate, measured process, unlikely to excite, but certain to fulfill its function. The gathering is complete. The table is set, simply, very simply. And the focus now narrows to the contents of your plate and the specific, sleep-inducing order in which you are meant to consume them. It's a moment of quiet readiness before the methodical work of eating begins. You are seated, the quiet pressing in, the simple plate before you. The journey to this table is complete, the preparation of the food finished. Now, the moment of consumption arrives. In the quiet discipline of the refectory, even the order in which you eat is prescribed. It's not a free-for-all, it's a sequence. And the first item you will interact with, the first thing that passes your lips in this silent meal, is almost invariably the bread. Look at it on your plate. That humble, dense loaf or piece of flatbread. It sits there, unassuming, yet carrying immense significance. It is the staff of life, the product of hard labor in the fields and the heat of the oven. It represents sustenance in its most basic form. This prioritization of bread is no surprise. It was the absolute dietary bedrock of ancient Egypt for millennia, and its fundamental importance carried over into the monastic diet. It's a mainstream historical fact that bread was the primary source of calories for most Egyptians, making it the natural starting point for any meal, monastic or otherwise. It was their pasta, rice, and potatoes all rolled into one less fluffy package. Imagine reaching for the bread. Your hand moves slowly, deliberately. There's no snatching or rushing. You feel the texture, rough, perhaps a little dusty from the journey from the bakery. Its weight is substantial. This is not airy, modern bread. It's solid, packed with sustenance. You pick it up. Before eating, you might perform a small, quiet ritual with the bread itself. A quirky tidbit from some monastic traditions is the practice of making the sign of the cross over the bread before breaking it or eating it, a silent blessing acknowledging it as a gift from God and perhaps consecrating it before consumption. Or maybe you just hold it for a moment, a quiet acknowledgement of its presence and importance before you begin. It's a small gesture, easily missed, but it imbues the simple act with spiritual meaning. It's like saying grace, but with a physical action that probably involves less mumbled embarrassment than at a modern family dinner. Then, you break a piece off the loaf. Ancient Egyptian bread was often baked in shapes or sizes that made it easy to break rather than cut. There might be a slight resistance as you snap the dense bread, a faint, dry sound in the silence. You hold the piece in your hand, feeling its texture, seeing the simple grain within. Why eat the bread first? There are several practical and symbolic reasons that align perfectly with the monastic ethos. Practically, the bread is the bulk of the meal. Eating it first helps to quickly satisfy initial hunger, making it easier to eat the rest of the meal mindfully and without feeling deprived or tempted to rush. It fills the stomach with the most basic, least exciting part of the meal, setting a tone of austerity from the outset. Symbolically, eating the bread first emphasizes its primary importance. It is the foundation upon which all other sustenance is built. In a Christian context, bread also carries deep religious significance, representing the body of Christ. While the daily meal was distinct from the Eucharist, the cultural and religious resonance of bread would have been profound. Eating it first could be seen as honoring this foundational element, both physically and spiritually. Historians still argue whether the practice of eating bread first was a universally codified rule across all early Egyptian monasteries, or if it was a widespread custom born out of practicality and tradition that became a de facto standard. Was there a specific written instruction in every monastic rulebook saying eat the bread before the beans? Or was it simply the way it was done, passed down through practice, because it made the most sense? The exact degree of explicit instruction versus ingrained habit is often debated. You bring the piece of bread to your mouth. The texture is firm, perhaps slightly rough. You bite into it. The taste is simple, the earthy flavor of grain, perhaps a hint of the baking process. It requires chewing. Deliberate, methodical chewing. You are not wolfing it down. You are consuming it, focusing on the physical reality of the food, while maintaining your inward spiritual focus. The silence of the refectory highlights the small sounds of your own eating, the quiet crunch of the bread, the subtle sounds of chewing. It's not loud or disruptive, it's just present. Each bite of bread is a small act of discipline. You eat enough to begin satisfying your hunger, but not so much that you feel full immediately. You are making space, both physically and in the structure of the meal, for the other components. The bread is the introduction, the opening statement of your humble meal. It sets the stage for what follows, providing the necessary foundation. It's the reliable bass line in the very quiet, very repetitive song of the monastic diet. As you chew and swallow the bread, feel its substance. It is providing the energy you need for the rest of the day's activities, for the evening prayers, for the hours of sleep before the cycle begins again. It is fueling the physical self that houses the spiritual self you are trying to cultivate. There's a quiet satisfaction in consuming this basic, necessary food, knowing it serves a vital purpose. The bread is the beginning. It's the first step in the ordered consumption of your meal. It's simple, it's plain, and it's designed to be consumed mindfully, without excess or distraction. You finish your portion of bread, or perhaps just a significant piece of it, leaving room for what comes next. The taste lingers, that dry, wholesome flavor. And the silence continues, unbroken save for the quiet sounds of eating. The foundation has been laid. Now, the rest of the meal can unfold, piece by methodical piece. You've taken that first bite. The dense bread, the cornerstone of your meal, has begun its work of providing sustenance. But the bread isn't just the first item you eat, it's the foundation of every single meal you will consume here in the monastery. It is the ever-present constant, the reliable core of your diet, day after day, year after year. Its role extends far beyond just the opening act of this one quiet meal. Think about your days, structured by prayer and labor. That energy comes primarily from this humble loaf. Grains, wheat and barley, were the most efficiently produced and stored staple crops in Egypt. They yielded a high amount of calories relative to the effort and resources required to grow them, compared to meat, for instance. For a community focused on self-sufficiency and austerity in a challenging environment, a grain-based diet centered around bread was the most practical and reliable way to feed everyone. This absolute centrality of bread to the Egyptian diet, including the monastic diet, is a mainstream historical fact. It was quite literally the staff of life. You were powered by bread, pure and simple. It was like the ancient version of a carb-loading athlete, but the sport was extreme piety. The type of grain would likely be emmer wheat or barley. Emmer was the traditional wheat of Egypt, hardy and well-suited to the climate. Barley was also commonly grown and consumed. These grains were ground into flour, a laborious process often done using simple stone querns, perhaps within the monastery itself. Imagine the sound of the stones grinding, the rhythmic, repetitive motion, another form of quiet, physical labor. The flour would be coarser than modern flour, containing more of the bran and germ, and likely some grit from the stones. This flour was then mixed with water, sometimes a bit of leavening, though unleavened flatbreads were also common, quicker to make and less fuel-intensive, formed into loaves, and baked. The baking would happen in a communal oven, likely a clay structure heated with wood or dried dung. Imagine the warmth radiating from the oven, the scent of baking bread filling a part of the monastery at certain times, perhaps one of the few appealing aromas in an otherwise scent-neutral environment. The bread itself varied. It might be a simple, dense flatbread, easy to break apart. Or it could be thicker, slightly leavened loaves. Its quality could also vary depending on the quality of the grain, the milling process, and the skill of the baker. Even in a monastery, some monks were probably better bakers than others. But whatever its specific form or quality, it was always there. For breakfast, if a light morning meal was permitted, for the main meal in the evening, sometimes even carried as a simple provision if a monk had to travel. It was the constant calorie supply, the fuel for their existence. A quirky tidbit about Egyptian bread is that different shapes and sizes were sometimes associated with different purposes or values, even among simple loaves. While the monk's bread was likely basic, in wider Egyptian society, bread could be shaped into figures or symbols for offerings or special occasions. For monks, the shape was probably functional, but the sheer act of producing and consuming this fundamental food might have taken on a quiet, almost ritualistic significance, the physical manifestation of their reliance on divine providence and their own labor. It's like finding spiritual meaning in a sandwich, but less complicated. Historians still argue whether the nutritional adequacy of the basic monastic diet, centered on bread and legumes with limited vegetables and fruits, was truly sufficient for the demanding physical labor they performed, especially considering their limited meal frequency. Did they suffer from chronic nutrient deficiencies? Or did the combination of nutrient-dense legumes, whole grains, and supplementary foraging, remember that, provide just enough to keep them going? It's a complex question, hard to answer definitively without detailed physiological data from ancient monks, which is, understandably, not available. Think about the sheer quantity of bread consumed by a monastery of hundreds of monks. Baking would be a near constant activity. The storerooms would be filled with sacks of grain. The rhythm of growing, harvesting, grinding, and baking grain underpinned the entire physical operation of the community. It was the logistical heart of their survival. For you, sitting at the table, the bread on your plate is more than just the first course. It represents this entire cycle of labor, this reliance on the most basic staple, this constant presence in your life. Every bite is a connection to the earth, to the sun, to the hands that worked the soil and kneaded the dough, to the heat of the oven. It is humble, but it is essential. It provides the energy for your prayers, the strength for your work, the substance that keeps you alive in the quiet austerity of the desert. The bread sits there, already begun, waiting to be finished alongside the other components of the meal. Its plainness is deliberate, its presence guaranteed. It asks nothing of you but to be consumed, methodically, mindfully, as the primary source of your physical strength. It's a quiet, dependable presence, like an old friend who doesn't say much but is always there for you. A very dense, very chewy old friend. And with the bread underway, your focus can now shift to the next item on the plate, the accompaniment that provides different nutrients and a slightly different texture and flavor profile. You've begun your quiet meal with the bread, that solid, dependable cornerstone. You've broken off a piece, perhaps offered a silent blessing, and started the methodical process of chewing and swallowing. The initial edge of hunger is blunted by the dense grain. Your focus now shifts from that primary staple to the accompanying dish on your plate or in your bowl. This is the heart of the vegetarian meal, the main source of sustained energy and protein beyond the carbohydrates in the bread, the cooked legumes or vegetable preparation. Look at it. It's likely a modest portion. Perhaps a bowl of something that resembles a thick soup or a watery stew. The color is probably muted, browns, greens, or dull yellows, depending on the ingredients. The consistency is likely uniform, not chunky with large pieces of vegetable, but cooked down until soft. This preparation, usually involving boiling legumes like lentils or fava beans, sometimes with added vegetables, into a simple stew or porridge-like consistency, was the standard way to consume these vital protein sources in ancient Egypt and many parts of the ancient world. It's a mainstream historical fact that cooked legumes were a primary non-grain staple, especially in plant-based diets, providing essential protein and fiber. They were the ancient world's quiet heroes of nutrition, working tirelessly behind the scenes. Feel the weight of the bowl, or see the portion resting beside your bread on the plate. There might be a faint aroma rising from it, the earthy smell of cooked beans, perhaps the sharper note of onion or garlic if they were included. It's not an exciting smell, it's a smell of nourishment, of simple, functional food. You would likely eat this dish with your fingers, or perhaps a simple wooden spoon if the monastery was slightly better equipped or the consistency demanded it. Forks weren't a thing yet, eating was a more direct, tactile experience. Imagine scooping a small amount onto your fingers or onto a piece of bread, or using a spoon to lift a portion from the bowl. There's no delicate swirling or artful presentation. It's just getting the food from the plate to your mouth as efficiently and quietly as possible. This direct interaction with the food using your hands was common in many ancient cultures, a quirky tidbit that feels very different from our modern utensil habits. Try eating soup with your fingers sometime. It really makes you appreciate a spoon. As you bring the food to your mouth, observe its texture. It's soft, perhaps mushy, definitely not firm or crispy. It requires minimal chewing compared to the dense bread. It slides down relatively easily. The taste is plain, the inherent flavor of the legume, maybe a hint of salt, the subtle sweetness or pungency of added vegetables. There are no complex layers of flavor, no surprising spices to awaken your taste buds. It is intentionally bland, designed to provide sustenance without stimulating desire or distracting the mind from spiritual pursuits. It's the culinary embodiment of just the facts, ma'am. Eating this requires patience and mindfulness, just like the bread. You don't rush. Each spoonful or handful is consumed deliberately. The silence in the refectory amplifies the small sounds you make, the quiet slurping if it's thin, the soft mashing sounds as you chew. It's a quiet, repetitive process, spoonful after spoonful, bite after bite. This dish is crucial for providing the protein needed to repair tissues and maintain strength for manual labor. While bread provided the quick energy, the legumes offered sustained release and the building blocks for physical endurance. Without them, a purely bread-based diet wouldn't be sustainable for long. They were the unsung heroes powering the basket weaving, manuscript copying, and wall-building activities of the monastery. Historians still argue whether the consistency of the main legume dish was generally a thick, scoopable porridge across different communities, or if it was more often a thinner, stew-like preparation intended to be eaten with bread dipped into it. Did it vary depending on water availability, cooking fuel, or local tradition? Was it always served warm, or sometimes cold? The textual sources and archaeological evidence provide clues, but not always a definitive, universal answer on the ideal ancient monastic lentil consistency. A surprisingly vigorous debate, I assure you. Contemplating this dish, you understand its role. It's not about culinary enjoyment, it's about physical necessity, met with deliberate plainness. Its sustenance reduced to its functional essence. The soft texture, the subtle taste, the feeling of it filling your stomach after the bread, it's all part of the quiet work of nourishing the body so the spirit can be free to pursue higher things. It's a constant exercise in self-control, in gratitude for simple provision, in resisting any urge towards gluttony or dissatisfaction. Oh, plain lentils again? How spiritually enriching. There's a simple dignity in this dish, despite its austerity. It represents the labor of the earth, the effort of cultivation and preparation, the shared sustenance of the community. It's food earned through prayer and work, consumed in silence and contemplation. You continue to eat, methodically, quietly. The portion is finishing. You scrape the last bits from the bowl with your fingers or spoon, ensuring nothing is wasted. Every drop, every seed, is valuable. The texture, the taste, the feeling of fullness, it all contributes to the quiet narrative of the meal. With the main dish consumed, the primary components of the meal are finished. The bread has provided the base, the legumes the protein and bulk. What remains? Perhaps smaller items, a touch of sweetness or freshness, little additions that provide minor nutritional boosts or a slight variation in texture and taste, but which are not central to the meal's core purpose. These minor players are the next focus of your quiet, sleepy contemplation. The main course is done. Time for the extremely low-key dessert? Or maybe just a side salad of cooked mallow. Exciting! You've finished the main portion of your meal, the cooked lentils or beans that provided the bulk of your protein and calories beyond the ever-present bread. The bowl or plate might be scraped clean with your fingers or spoon, leaving nothing to waste. Every calorie counts in this disciplined life. Your focus shifts now to any remaining items on your plate, the accompanying pieces, the side dishes, the subtle ways the food might have been flavored. These weren't elaborate courses following the main. Remember, this is a meal of austerity. The side dishes were simple additions, providing a little variety or a specific nutritional boost. Most commonly, this would involve dried fruits. Look at your plate again. Are there a few shriveled-looking shapes? These are likely dried dates or figs. Dates, in particular, were a vital source of natural sugar and quick energy in ancient Egypt, easy to grow and preserve in the dry climate. Their presence, even in small quantities, was a welcome touch of sweetness in an otherwise plain diet. Providing dried fruits like dates and figs was a mainstream historical fact of the ancient Egyptian diet, and their inclusion in monastic meals provided necessary calories and natural sweetness. They were nature's energy bar, ancient edition. Imagine picking up a dried date. It feels leathery, sticky. Its color is dark, concentrated. You bring it to your mouth. As you chew, the concentrated sweetness unfolds, a stark contrast to the earthy plainness of the bread and legumes. You don't pop it into your mouth mindlessly, you chew it slowly, savoring the intense sweetness, the slightly chewy texture. This small burst of sugar is a quiet indulgence, but a necessary one, providing fuel and perhaps making the rest of the meal slightly more palatable. It's probably the closest thing to dessert you're going to get tonight. Enjoy it. Slowly. Very slowly. Other side items might include fresh or cooked vegetables, beyond those potentially mixed into the main stew. Perhaps a piece of raw onion or garlic. While cooked into the stew, some accounts suggest these were also eaten raw. Imagine biting into a piece of raw onion. The sharp, pungent flavor, the crisp texture. It's certainly not bland. It provides a strong counterpoint to the softness of the other foods. Onions and garlic weren't just for flavor, they were widely believed to have medicinal properties and provide strength. Their pervasive use in the Egyptian diet, even in ascetic contexts, is a quirky tidbit. They were clearly considered too valuable, in terms of both taste and health, to be entirely given up for austerity's sake. Your spiritual journey might leave you pure of heart, but perhaps not of breath. Cooked greens, like mallow leaves, might also be served separately or mixed in less thoroughly than in the main stew. Their texture would be soft, their flavor mild and earthy. You might scoop them up with a piece of bread or eat them directly. They added vitamins and minerals to a diet that could otherwise be limited in fresh produce. Now, consider seasoning. The primary seasonings were simple. Salt was essential, needed for bodily function, especially in a hot climate where you would sweat. It was likely added during cooking. Onions and garlic provided the main flavor compounds. Were there other spices? Probably very few, if any, on a regular basis. Spices from places like the East were expensive and considered luxuries. Their use would contradict the ascetic ideal of plainness and renunciation of worldly pleasures. A monk's meal was not meant to be a festival for the taste buds. It was meant to be consumed without complaint or craving for more. Historians still argue whether the variety of vegetables available to monastic communities extended significantly beyond basic staples like onions, garlic, mallow, cucumbers, and lettuce, or if access to different kinds of produce was highly limited and infrequent. Did some monasteries cultivate or trade for a wider array of seasonal vegetables? Or was the consistent diet much more restricted to just a few hardy types? The archaeological evidence and texts give us clues, but a comprehensive ancient monastic vegetable shopping list is, sadly, elusive. Eating these side items is also done with the same quiet focus as the main meal. You appreciate the distinct texture of the date, the bite of the onion, the softness of the greens. Each element is distinct, yet part of the whole meal. There's a rhythm to it, a bite of bread, a scoop of lentils, perhaps now a chew of a date or a piece of onion. It's a quiet rotation of textures and simple flavors. The limited seasoning and variety meant that the taste of the food was very much the taste of its core ingredients. You learn to appreciate the subtle differences between types of lentils or the sweetness of a really good date. Your palate, stripped of stimulation from complex spices and rich flavors, would become attuned to these simple notes. It's like only listening to acoustic music after years of heavy metal. Suddenly, you notice the quiet nuances. This simplicity of seasoning is a deliberate choice, part of the fight against gluttony and sensuality. Food is fuel, not entertainment. The less appealing it is to the senses beyond satisfying hunger, the better it serves the purpose of ascetic discipline. Imagine trying to find spiritual enlightenment while distracted by the complex aroma of curry or the satisfying crunch of a perfectly seasoned roast potato. It's much easier when your main flavor profile is boiled and slightly oniony. So, you finish your side items, perhaps saving the sweet date for last as a final, quiet note to the savory and plain components. The plate is now truly empty, scraped clean. Nothing is left behind. Every crumb, every seed, every bit of cooked vegetable has served its purpose, providing necessary nourishment to fuel the spiritual journey. The consumption of the meal is complete. The bread provided the base, the legumes the substance, and the side items a touch of variety and energy. All consumed in silence, according to a quiet, internal, or external order. The physical act of eating, so often a source of pleasure and social interaction, has been transformed into a deliberate, disciplined, almost solitary task, even when performed communally. The textures, the simple tastes, the quiet sounds of eating in the silent refectory, it all contributes to a profound sense of stillness and austerity. The food is eaten. What remains is the drink, and the quiet conclusion of the meal ritual before returning to the larger cycle of monastic life. You've carefully consumed the last bit of the solid food, the bread, the lentils, perhaps that precious dried date. The plate is clean, the bowl scraped. The primary act of nourishment is complete. But there's one final element to this simple meal, something essential for survival, especially in the dry, demanding environment of the desert monastery, the drink. Look beside your plate. There sits a simple vessel, likely a cup or a small jug made of clay pottery, perhaps unglazed and rough to the touch, or possibly wood. It holds the liquid refreshment provided with the meal. This wasn't a selection of beverages, it was typically one or two basic options. The most fundamental, of course, was water. Access to clean water was paramount, a constant concern and often a significant labor for desert communities who relied on wells or cisterns. Providing water with meals was a basic necessity, a mainstream historical fact for survival in any hot climate, let alone the arid conditions the monks chose. Staying hydrated wasn't a luxury, it was life support. Imagine trying to chant psalms for hours with a parched throat. Not ideal. The water might taste faintly of the clay vessel it was kept in, or perhaps have a mineral quality depending on the source of the well. It would be cool, but not chilled, no ancient ice machines here. Just plain water, essential and unadorned. Its purpose is purely functional, to quench thirst, to help wash down the dense food, to replenish fluids lost throughout the day's labor under the sun. There's no flavor to savor, no complex aroma to contemplate. Just the simple, life-giving wetness. The other common drink, if available and permitted by the monastery's rule, was wine. But not the rich, alcoholic wine you might picture from Roman banquets. Monastic wine was typically diluted with water, often significantly. This served several purposes. It stretched the supply of wine, reduced its alcoholic content. Alcohol could be seen as a source of temptation or cloud the mind needed for prayer, and made it a source of hydration as well as a mild, slightly more palatable drink than just plain water for some. Imagine something more like flavored water than actual wine, maybe a hint of grape sweetness and fermentation, but mostly just wetness. This practice of diluting wine for regular consumption was common in the ancient Mediterranean world, not just in monasteries, making it a relatively standard, if slightly less ascetic, option. The choice between water and diluted wine might vary depending on the specific monastery, the day of the week, or the status of the monk, though status differences were ideally minimized in monastic communities. Some stricter rules might have permitted only water, seeing even diluted wine as a step too far towards indulgence. Others might have allowed wine, perhaps as a nod to its role in biblical narratives or simply as a traditional part of the local diet that was hard to fully abandon. When would you drink? There wasn't necessarily a rigid rule about drinking only after finishing the solid food, although you might save a significant portion for the end to wash everything down and cleanse your palate. You likely took sips throughout the meal as needed, between bites of dry bread or spoonfuls of thick stew. This isn't like a modern formal dinner where you might wait for a specific moment. Thirst in the desert is a potent, immediate sensation. Historians still argue whether there was a specific, customary sequence for drinking during the meal, for instance, a sip before starting, sips between each type of food, or primarily drinking at the end. Given the lack of strict uniformity in monastic rules outside the core principles, it's plausible this aspect was less regulated than the eating of the solid food, allowing monks to drink as their thirst dictated, provided it was done quietly and without drawing attention. Was there a formal rule like thou shalt take 3 sips of water after consuming the lentils, or was it more like drink when you're thirsty, just don't make a fuss? A quirky tidbit related to monastic drinks is the potential for variations based on local resources. In areas with access to palm trees, a drink made from palm sap might occasionally be available. Or perhaps infusions of certain herbs, though these might be considered more medicinal than standard mealtime beverages. These local variations would add tiny wrinkles to the otherwise extremely plain dietary fabric. Imagine getting excited because tonight's drink was slightly different, maybe flavored with a leaf you foraged yourself earlier that day. Thrilling. Holding the cup, feel its surface. It's cool against your palm. You lift it to your lips. The liquid slides into your mouth. If it's water, it's simply wet, cool, refreshing in its plainness. If it's diluted wine, there's a faint, perhaps slightly sour taste, a subtle sweetness that quickly fades, leaving the essential wetness. You swallow. Feel the liquid traveling down, hydrating your dry throat, settling in your stomach alongside the recently consumed food. Drinking is a quiet act. There's no clinking of glasses, no toasts. Just the subtle sound of swallowing. You drink enough to feel comfortable, but probably not to excess. Gluttony wasn't limited to food. Overdrinking could also be seen as a form of indulgence or lack of discipline. So, you drink what you need, mindfully, efficiently. The vessel itself is simple, a tool for delivering the necessary liquid. It's not decorative, it's functional, like everything else associated with this meal. Its weight lessens as you drink. You might place it back down on the table or mat beside your plate, the sound a soft clink or thud in the pervasive silence. This act of drinking marks the very end of the consumption phase of the meal. The solid food is gone, the liquid has been consumed. Your physical body has received the necessary fuel and hydration. The meal, as a series of physical acts of consumption, is complete. The focus now shifts from the physical act of eating and drinking to the quiet period that follows, the transition from sustenance back to the core practices of monastic life, prayer, contemplation, silence. The taste of water or diluted wine lingers faintly. It's a clean, simple taste, washing away the remnants of bread and beans. It's the final sensory input of the meal, understated and functional. You are nourished. You are hydrated. And the quiet process of eating, with its specific order and simple components, has served its purpose. The plate is empty, the cup is finished. The refectory is still. It's time for the meal's quiet conclusion and the gentle return to the stillness of the monastic evening. You've taken that final sip of water or diluted wine, setting the cup back down on the table or mat with a quiet touch. Your plate is empty, scraped clean. The meal is finished. That deliberate sequence, bread first, then the main dish of legumes, followed by any sides or dried fruit, and finally the drink, is complete. You sit there for a moment in the stillness, the physical process concluded. Imagine the quiet in the refectory now that most, if not all, of your brothers have finished eating as well. The subtle sounds of consumption cease, replaced by a profound, collective silence. Perhaps you can hear the soft sound of breathing, the rustle of cloth as someone shifts slightly, the distant, muffled sounds of the monastery if any work is still ongoing elsewhere. This period of quiet stillness immediately following the meal was likely a common practice, allowing the body to begin digesting and the mind to return fully to contemplation after the brief necessary focus on the physical act of eating. It's like the ancient equivalent of leaning back from the table and just being. What happens next? There might be a final, short communal prayer led by the abbot or another elder, giving thanks for the sustenance received. Or perhaps a simple signal, a nod or a soft tap of a hand, indicating that the meal period is officially over. The transition is quiet, seamless. This communal closing of the meal, often with a prayer of thanksgiving, is a mainstream historical fact in many communal religious traditions, including monasticism, marking the end of the shared activity and the return to individual or other communal duties. It's the ancient world's way of clearing your plate and saying amen. After this signal, or perhaps after a set period of quiet, the monks would rise from their places. Again, the movement would be orderly, silent, or with minimal communication. You would likely gather your simple eating vessels, your plate, your bowl, your cup, and perhaps carry them to a designated area for cleaning. Washing up would be another simple chore, often done communally, the sound of water and pottery adding another brief, quiet note to the monastery soundscape. This shared responsibility for tasks like cleaning further reinforced the communal aspect and the renunciation of personal service. Everyone, regardless of their background, participated in the mundane work of the community. Imagine the abbot himself quietly washing dishes alongside the newest novice. Humbling work, indeed. Though perhaps some had designated dishwashing monks. Historians still argue whether tasks like washing dishes were rotated equally among all monks, or if certain roles, even humble ones, became specialized within communities based on skill or internal hierarchy. Was there a chief dishwasher monk? We may never know, but it's fun to imagine the quiet politics of the ancient sink. Once the dishes were dealt with, the monks would disperse from the refectory. You might return to your individual cell for solitary prayer or study, or proceed to the chapel for an evening prayer service. The period immediately following the meal, particularly if it was the main meal of the day, might lead directly into a longer period of quietude or sleep before the cycle of prayer began again in the early hours of the morning. The body is nourished, the immediate physical need met, allowing the spiritual work to continue without the distraction of hunger. The purpose of the meal, as a moment of disciplined refueling, is underscored by its conclusion. There's no lingering over dessert, no lively conversation, no planning for the rest of the evening's entertainment. The meal was a necessary pause, efficiently handled, allowing a swift return to the core business of the monastic life, spiritual pursuit. It wasn't the highlight of the day in terms of pleasure, but in terms of providing the physical foundation for everything else, it was essential. Think about the feeling of having finished eating. The slight fullness in your stomach from the bread and lentils, the memory of the simple taste of water or perhaps a date. Your senses, which were briefly engaged by the physical act of eating, are now released. The focus turns inward again, or upward towards the divine. The silence feels different now, perhaps deeper, settled by the shared, quiet act that has just concluded. A quirky tidbit is that in some monastic traditions, monks would deliberately leave a small amount of food on their plate as a final act of self-denial, a visual reminder that they ate only what was necessary and always held back from complete satiation. This wasn't about waste, but a symbolic gesture of control over appetite. Imagine carefully leaving a single lentil or a small crumb of bread. It adds a layer of subtle, private discipline to the already austere meal. Just one lentil left. Resisting. As you leave the refectory, moving back into the monastery's quiet spaces, the sounds of your own body might be more noticeable in the stillness, your breathing, perhaps the subtle sounds of digestion. It's a reminder of the physical self that is being disciplined and sustained. The light outside is likely gone now, or very low, the monastery illuminated only by the soft glow of oil lamps casting long, dancing shadows. The air is cooler, the desert night beginning to assert itself. Your mind settles. The details of the meal, the rough texture of the bread, the plainness of the lentils, the sweetness of the date, the coolness of the water, begin to fade, becoming part of the background experience of the day. They serve their purpose. Now, the quiet stretches out before you, hours of contemplation, perhaps prayer, and eventually, the deep, necessary rest that will prepare you for the start of the cycle again at dawn. The journey through the order of this ancient monk's vegetarian meal is complete. We've sat in the quiet refectory, explored the reasons for the austerity, identified the simple ingredients, followed the process of preparation, arrived at the moment of receiving the food, and meticulously examined the likely order of consumption, right down to the final sip of water. It was a journey into the wonderfully mundane, the deeply practical aspects of a life dedicated to the spiritual. There was no drama, no excitement, just routine, discipline, and quiet sustenance. And that quiet, that routine, that focus on the simple and the necessary, is precisely what makes this slice of history so uniquely suited for winding down. The mental effort required was minimal, the imagery was muted, the pace was slow. You are now, hopefully, in a state of deep relaxation, having drifted through the ancient desert, sat in silent contemplation with a plate of beans and bread, and emerged on the other side, peaceful and ready for sleep. The historical exploration is finished. The quiet of the monastic night is here. The sounds of the ancient monastery are fading now, becoming soft echoes on the edge of hearing. The rustle of robes, the shuffle of sandals, the quiet clink of pottery, they are all receding. The scent of dust and old stone is gently dissolving. You are no longer sitting in the refectory. You are here, comfortable, safe, completely relaxed. The desert air is replaced by the comforting air of your own space, the dim lamplight by the darkness behind your eyelids. Feel yourself sinking deeper into the surface beneath you. Your body is heavy, peaceful. The thoughts about bread, lentils, and silent monks are drifting away, like clouds moving slowly across a vast, empty sky. There is nothing left to analyze, nothing left to understand. Just let go of the historical details, the specific order of the meal, the quiet discipline of the past. It has served its purpose, guiding you gently to this moment of profound stillness. Your breathing is soft, even. Your body is still. The journey is over, the day is done. All that remains is this feeling of quiet peace, this readiness for rest. The ancient world is silent. The historical details are sleeping. And you, too, are ready to join them in the quiet realm of dreams. Just let yourself drift, further, deeper, into the soft, welcoming darkness. Sleep is here. Sweet dreams.